to this year's summit, the Homeschooling Global Summit 2020. Joining us this year is Dr. Naomi Fisher. Hey Naomi, thank you so much for spending the time today.
Hello, thank you for inviting me to come and talk.
Well, Naomi is a psychologist and has done a great deal of work around studying how the psychological aspect of self-directed learners and kids going to school, and lots of experience in this field. And I think really important right now as well with people being in confinement and lockdown, lots to talk about. But first of all, Naomi, how did you kind of fall down the rabbit hole of choosing to go the route of, use air quotes, alternative education?
Okay, well, as for everyone, there's always a long and convoluted story, but I think what really set me up to question the paradigm of education as we understand it was that I actually spent my childhood moving from country to country due to my parents' work, and I attended 11 different schools between the ages of 5 and 18. And they really covered the whole gamut of schools. I went to an international school in Africa. I went to a state comprehensive school in the UK. I went to a girls' grammar school. I went to a Steiner school. I went to the whole set. I even went to a boarding school. You know, I covered a lot of the educational choices available. And what struck me was that a lot of the things people said about school and said were absolutely necessary at school varied from school to school. So for example, I went to the girls' grammar school I went to. We had a very strict school uniform. It was all about having your skirt the right length. And there was literally a teacher at the door measuring your skirt length as you went in. And if your skirt was too long or too short, off you went back home to get your next skirt. This is something they don't do to boys. It's a girls' thing. Anyway, and yeah, I'd just come from a school where everybody wore exactly what they wanted. And everyone wore jeans, and skirt length wasn't even an issue because actually very few girls chose to wear skirts when they were given a choice. So it seemed weird to me that schools imposed all of this control on us in the name of education, and yet different schools didn't do that. So this started me off, I think, on a path of questioning what is really going on here. What is education really about? Because everybody else just seemed to assume that these things were how school worked. No one else was going, hang on a minute, why are we even having to wear all the same skirts? What is this about? Because they'd been enculturated into that idea. So then as I grew up and I went to university and I became a psychologist, and I did a PhD working with children with autism and other learning disabilities. And then I started specializing in trauma and complex trauma as a clinical psychologist. And then I started working with children who were really unhappy at school. And I wasn't working with them because they were unhappy at school. That wasn't why they came. They came because their parents were worried about them, or the school was worried about them. And they came because I was working in a neurodevelopmental service, which means we were diagnosing children with ADHD and autism. And it was a very full-on process. Every day there'd be a new child in, we would have these lengthy interviews with them. Someone else would be doing sort of observations with the child. We'd be collecting reports from teachers. It was a whole big assessment. And as I saw each child, I just became more and more concerned about the way that the stories the children were telling me about how they felt at school and what was going on at school. And yet the only thing I was really offering them was a diagnosis and a letter back to the parents saying, these are the things, and the teachers, these are the things this child has difficulty with. So it was always about the child and what difficulties the child had. Never was there any potential for me to say, maybe school just really doesn't suit this child. In fact, that would have been quite a radical thing to say. And if a child did come along who was home educated, which they did pop up from time to time, there was a bit of wariness on everybody's part. All the professionals would be like, oh, home education, maybe we should be trying to encourage this child back into school. So that made me, and I felt like, this is wrong. We need to be looking at what is school doing to these children, because this is a lot of children. We had a waiting list of 2 years of these children coming. People were desperate for these diagnoses because they saw the diagnosis as a key to the school system, giving them a bit of leeway, being a bit more flexible with this child. And I think that is unfortunately how it works. You need to say this child has more problems than everybody else. They need extra support. Maybe they need movement breaks, or they need a bit of time out, or they need a room to go to. But what about the system? What are we doing in this system that's so rigid that it's causing this extreme distress in children? And that made me think we really need to start thinking about this differently. So that's a long story, but that's sort of where I got there.
Wow, and there's just so much important stuff to go into there. I want to start then with parents that have faced this before, where they get pulled aside at the school gate,
Yeah.
or in a parents' evening, or whatever it might be, or an email or a phone call,
Mm-hmm.
and then they have this awful, stressful anxiety because they feel as though there's something wrong with their son or their daughter, because they're acting up at school.
Yeah. Well, it's worse than that, actually, because often the first thing they're told is there's something wrong with your parenting, or at least that's how they feel. That often the first thing is you need to control your child better at school. So you need to talk, there's a whole narrative around parents not supporting children at school, isn't there? And what supporting children at school means is telling them they've got to do what the teacher says, making them do their homework, getting them to school at 9 o'clock. So often, actually, the first thing parents are told is, you need to try harder. You need to, this child doesn't understand this culture. We use whole language. This child isn't school ready, for example. So, and that's the parent's fault. I mean, I don't think it is, but that's how it's often portrayed. You haven't done enough work with your child. Your child doesn't understand they have to be able to sit in this classroom with everybody else. This child doesn't understand that they can't stay out in the playground if they want to. They don't understand that they can't leave the room when they want to. You need to change your child. And then, in a way, those are the only two hypotheses that parents are offered. They're either offered, there's something wrong with your child, they're disordered, or there's something wrong with how you're parenting your child. And there's a psychologist called Mary Boyle who talks about the brain or blame dilemma that we put people into, that where the only two choices about why this problem is here is there's something wrong with your brain or it's your fault. There's nothing else. And what I want to do is think about, how about if there's actually a whole different explanation, which is this environment just doesn't suit this child. And actually, maybe it doesn't suit lots of kids, loads and loads of them. But because we're saying all the time the problem is the child, we never actually look at what's wrong with the environment.
Yeah. And the environment is so protected, because we've swallowed this narrative of, what's the first thing people come back with is, education is a human right, or,
and that's because we equate education with school. And that's something which I think we really need to change. I mean, my whole idea is how, in order to do self-directed education, I think parents need to change their thinking. And one of the ways we need to do that is we need to step back from the idea that a child out of school is not learning, and a child out of school is not being educated, because there are loads of ways of different ways of being educated. And the whole idea of school is a really relatively recent import into our understanding. And yet it has been spread colonially. It's been spread through the world as this is the way to do it. And it's not that different to how it was done 150 years ago when it started. You have one adult at the front, you have children sitting in rows, and the adult knows, the adult is the one in control. The adult's the one who chooses what we're going to do. And their job is to get the children on side to do that with them. And, they have different techniques now than the Victorians had. They're a bit less punitive and they're a bit more sort of, let's make it fun and interesting. But the fundamental thing is the same. The teacher is the one who knows what everybody should be learning. The teacher is the one in control.
Yes, it's a top-down structure, isn't it? Authoritarian, totalitarian rule.
Totally.
And
yeah.
How will we? Then we're not even addressing the fact that that they spend this time in a totalitarian environment under this guise of we are teaching them to be democratic.
Well, under the guise of empowering them. When you say education's a human right, the way we talk about education is all about how we need, when we educate a child, they become empowered, they become able to do this stuff. But it doesn't work for any other group of society. We don't say, right, we're going to empower you all, and the way we're going to do it is you all have to dress the same, you all have to turn up the same time every day, you have to come, you're only allowed to bring certain things in your lunchbox, you're only not allowed to bring any of your special things to school. If you've got a toy you want, no, sorry, phones, leave them at home, all of that. And you're coming into this regime and you're going to behave like everybody else for 12 years probably, and at the end of it, there you are, you'll be empowered. It just doesn't make sense, does it? Think about if we said that to adults. Adults would revolt at the end of a week.
It is.
And then, yet we're saying the children who revolt are the problem. rather
Let's
than
get
the
back to
system.
that. Let's not brush
Mm.
over this, because I've got a real, we were talking just before we started recording here, a big worry about the system that you described, about how once you see these kids as a psychologist and you can make a diagnosis, you were talking about like you've got checklists
Yeah.
that you are probably given by the like a government official
There are
body.
manuals. There are manuals. There's a diagnostic statistical manual in America, and there's an international classification of diseases manual in the UK and in Europe. And you look at whether children fit certain criteria. Yeah, that is what you do. And the interviews vary on how in depth you go into that and how much you're looking for. But that is what you're doing. You're looking for, do the children fit this checklist ultimately?
And then this rise in ADHD, for example, this huge spike over the last 20 years maybe.
Yeah.
What's going on?
Well, obviously, I don't know exactly what's going on, but I know a few things are coming together. I think one of the things that's coming together is the focus in schools on standardization, on accountability, on high stakes testing from very early on, which means that the focus is earlier and earlier on how are these children achieving? Are they measuring up to some standard? And if they're not, then again, we're stuck in that dichotomy. Who do we blame? Do we blame the parents? Do we blame the child? Because we're not going to blame the school system. We're not going to say, maybe it's just not right to be seeing whether children can read at 5, for example, and then using that as a measure. So I think the more inflexible the school system is, the more flexibility we require of young children who have to adapt to it. And that the children who have more difficulty with that earlier on are the ones who get labelled, who get sort of focused on as the problems, because they just haven't got that level of flexibility when they're young. And I think we need to be far more varied in what we expect from children at different ages. Like we know when they do comparisons of education systems, we know, for example, that in the UK, where we start children off very early, aged 4 or 5, we know that we have a huge effect between the youngest children in the year and the oldest children in the year. And that follows through right through to their end of school exams, where they say that being born in August as opposed to September, because the August children are the youngest, can result in a grade difference in GCSE. So we know it affects them right from the beginning and all the way through. And we know that children in countries where they start later, for example, in Denmark, they start around the age of 7 or 8, formal schooling starts then, they don't have that age effect, because they've given the children more of a chance to develop, and so they haven't got such a deep discrepancy. So that indicates it's not necessarily a difference in maturity at age 16, which is leading to this issue. It's that they come into school too early, and that follows through, because what children learn about themselves early on in education follows through with them. So if a child goes into school and learns, I'm no good at this, I can't do this, I'm stupid, unfortunately, they tend to carry that with them. And I work with children and adults, actually. I also work with lots of adults who've had bullying at school and troubles with the school system. And they still feel that. They still feel that in their 20s, 30s, 40s. They still feel, I'm stupid, I'm no good at maths. No good at maths is a particularly common one to have. It's like, what do? We all go to school to learn that we're no good at maths. Great. So you asked about ADHD, but the other factor is absolutely, without a doubt, the pressure from pharmaceutical companies to diagnose children, because if we diagnose children, then we can sell them drugs. And there's a really interesting book called Selling Sickness, which looks at how pharmaceutical companies promote diagnoses, because in the UK, at least, and in most of Europe, they can't promote drugs. They can't promote drugs directly to consumers. They can't say, this drug is great, it'll stop you from this. So instead they say, this diagnosis will change your life. It's transformatory. Get a diagnosis. And they're doing this with adults as well now. And if you go to look on some of the sites, it's quite mind-blowing. You'll see all these headlines like, my transformatory diagnosis of ADHD, or my magical diagnosis of ADHD. I'm like, this is really odd. Where's this? How has it become that a label of diagnosis given to you by a psychiatrist or a psychologist is transforming your life? What is it about this that's enabling you to feel that now you're okay? And I think it's the brain or blame dichotomy again, that people feel They learn through the school system that if we haven't said something's wrong with you, you're something wrong with your brain, then it must be your fault. And if you feel alienated at school, if you feel stupid at school, if you feel that, you'd rather be anywhere else, that's because there's something wrong with you. And so it's a massive relief for people to be told, well, yes, but we know what that something is. And it's a disease, a disorder. It can be medicated. It can be changed. It's not your fault. But those are the only two possibilities that people have. And really, I think, again, we need to be saying, it's not your fault that you thought you were stupid. You were in a system which told you were stupid. And maybe that's what was wrong, that the system should have changed, not you.
Yeah, it's really, really, oh man. Yeah. I mean, sitting here listening to you, I'm thinking like, what we talked about at the beginning. If you are that parent and you're told that, right, there's something wrong with your child, then you take that internally and you blame yourself and you start asking questions, what have I done? And then you just start searching for that diagnosis. And because you think that's the golden egg.
It feels like the solution. Yeah.
Whereas really, what's happening? There's nothing medically wrong with the child, really. I mean,
well, there's absolutely nothing medically wrong. That's for sure. It's behavior. And I'm not saying, I know that the behaviors do exist and are different. And I know there's a big controversy because sometimes people are like, oh, it's, children will stop having these behaviors if you take them out of school. I don't think that's true. I think there's a great range of different temperaments that children are born with. Diversity is an amazing strength of the human race. We have all sorts of differences present in children, and those differences need different environments to thrive. And the school system is not one in which all human children thrive. And that's the bit which schools don't really understand, because of course they see themselves as very important. And of course they are for lots of children, but their approach will always be more school. Let's adjust school so it works, but more school. It has to stay within this paradigm of you need to be at school because that's the way you'll learn.
And you've specialized in trauma, which is very, very interesting, and taking a close look at like the lasting effects of what might happen and occur if you do go down that road of finding the diagnosis, taking the drugs, and then just keeping them in the system.
I mean, for some children that works. So for some children it really helps. And I wouldn't like, if parents are listening to this and this is what they've done, I understand completely why parents would do that. You're trying to do the best for your child. And I think all parents want to do the best for their child. It's just very hard for parents to pull apart the wood from the trees and see what is the best, because typically professionals will be telling them school is the best thing. Teachers will be telling them school is the best thing. Let's adjust this child so they fit with school. There's a great book by Carla Shalaby called Troublemakers. I don't know if you know it, that she looks at 6 to 7 year olds coming into school, and they are identified as the troublemakers in their class. They're the disruptive children. And she does these fantastic close observations of them adjusting to school culture and how they aren't adjusting to school culture. And she uses their examples to show up how very repressive, oppressive this school culture is. And for the majority of the children, and I count myself as one of these children, I complied at school. I didn't feel oppressed at school. I liked school. I fitted in. I did what I was told. And because of that, I got positive reinforcement all the time. But the children who don't do that, I think Carla Shalaby says that they're like the canaries in the mine. They're showing us that there's something toxic in this air. And we need to listen to them. We need to say, what is this child's behavior really showing us? What is this child's behavior telling us about how they feel? Because the problem with the diagnosis system is that it looks at behavior as a symptom. So once you see behavior as a symptom of a disease or a disorder, you stop asking, what does this behavior actually mean? What's it telling me? So for example, a child can't sit still in class and is moving around and, jumping up and down and bouncing off the walls. You say, of course they do. They've got ADHD. That's obvious. That's what children with ADHD do. But actually, doesn't help us understand, because we don't know what ADHD actually is. There's no biological test for it. We don't know what there is that's different there. So we could look on it in a different way and say, well, that child is showing us that really sitting still and listening is not where they're at right now. That isn't what's working for them in terms of learning. How about if we said, okay, clearly you need to really move around, and you need to be able to learn as you move around, and the classroom is not the right place for you. Then we're in a whole different paradigm. We're listening to what the child is telling us, as opposed to saying, that's one of your symptoms and we need to give you something to help you conform.
Yeah. And to one of my favorite quotes of Sir Ken Robinson's is, you can't sit a 6-year-old down to do low grade clerical work for 8 hours a day. And
you could try. You could try. Yes. And not even pay them. That's the thing, for those who do low-grade clerical work, they usually do it because they're paid. We set up for ourselves such a difficult paradigm for children, because we have to get them in there and keep them in there. And there are no real rewards until they're about 16. That's when the payoff is meant to come. It's not like, the rest of us, if we're doing a boring job, we can justify it to ourselves. Well, at least I'm earning money, hopefully, that will keep me alive. Children can't say that. That's not why they're doing it. They're doing it because somebody else has told them they have to do it. And
then, like you say, like you get to 16 and everyththing you've worked for, if that grade comes in lower than you expected, then there's trauma again.
What do you do then? I know. And you've learned that you're a failure. So you've spent 12 years of your childhood learning that you're a failure. And that people really carry that with them. I can't emphasize that enough, that when I see people, school bullying and the beliefs that people formed about themselves at school come up again and again and again, particularly with people who were unusual in some way at school, who stood out in some way at school. For whatever reason, they will report generally having felt really alienated, but also overt bullying going on in the school environment by teachers and by other children. And they carry that with them because they have to keep going back in. That's the thing about school. I mean, I myself had some very unhappy experiences in some of my schools, and just the reality of being really unhappy somewhere and having to go back the next day, and knowing you have to go back the next day and the next day and the next day until you're 16. It's a really difficult thing to do to somebody. And I think it's very difficult for children to make sense of that, because the people around them are telling them that this is for their own good. We're doing this for you because we love you. We're making you go to school because we care too much about you to let you drop out. So they're in this really, it doesn't fit. They're thinking, I feel awful there. I feel terrible, but everybody's telling me it's for my own good. And I think that damages people. It's very difficult for them then as adults to reconnect with what is actually for their own good and what they want to do. And because we've squashed that. We spent their childhood squashing it.
It's so true. It really is. What would you say, because we're going to have a lot of parents and families tuning in this year that ended up homeschooling when they'd never ever thought that it was even an option, even a thing. They might never have even heard of homeschooling before. And I want to point out, what's been occurring is more just school at home rather than what we would class as homeschooling, as self-directed led, education. But to some of those people that are watching now and they're listening to this and they're thinking about their own son or their own daughter, that they might have seen like a few signs of difference in just their natural being. What are some of like the red flags do you think that they should look for, and perhaps we really should look into a different option?
Well, I think Alan Thomas, who's a British researcher now, who's done some research into home education, talks about the process that parents go through when their children come out of school. And he says that one of the things that we notice is that they often notice is that children start to refuse to comply with what school would make them do. And that if the parents are responsive to that, there's a process they go through, a bit like scientists, because you listen to your child more at home. It's inevitable. A parent listens to their child more, we hope, than a teacher, because a teacher has 30 children. I always think it's strange that teachers have 30 children to manage, and yet we go to parents' evening, it's the teacher who tells the parents how the child's doing. rather than the parent telling the teacher how the child does. But, you know, the parent has so much more time with the child. And if you ask most parents, they have a really close, nuanced understanding of their child and what their child is good at. They know things like they can go to a bookshelf and pick out a book and be like, yeah, that'll be about the right level. Or this will be about this will be something they're interested in. They know all those things about their child. So I think part of it is parents taking back their power and saying, you know what, I actually know my child. And even though this teacher is a professional and they're a professional in education, they've only got my child for 1 year as one of 30. And probably I understand my child better than they do. And I think there's a lot of invalidation of parents that goes on in our society, unfortunately, where we assume that professionals know better about children than the parents do. And I've been part of that myself, definitely as a psychologist. You sort of write letters where you're sort of implying that really you know better. Like I wrote letters very early on in my career. I wrote letters saying I thought children should be back at school when they were out of school. And the parents were saying this child's unhappy at school. And at the time I hadn't been through this whole process I've been through now. And my mindset was, you know, well-functioning child needs to be at school. So that's what I would suggest. And I think it's the first step for parents needs to be parents taking a step back and saying, what do I really see in my child here? What do I really know about my child? You know, do they skip off every morning happily to school? Are they can't wait to go back to school now because it's so great? Or are they actually thinking, wow, this is amazing. I can just breathe out for a bit and I can do the things that really I enjoy. I think one of the difficulties for parents at the moment is that parents and schools use parents to control children. So schools will say to parents, you know, you've got to get them up in the morning, you've got to get their hair brushed, their uniforms washed, all of that. That's your responsibility. And you've got to help them with their homework. You've got to support them in their school. So schools sort of co-opt parents into the school. And it's difficult for parents to take a step back and say, if it was just about me and my child here and the school wasn't there, what would we be doing together? And I think lots of parents have been in that kind of trap with COVID at home with their children, that they feel like they've got more of the responsibility, but the school is still trying to remotely control them. The school's sending books home and saying, you need to do this. And who's the one who's going to make them do it is the parent, because the child isn't going to be doing it of their own choice. And I think that's where the element of discovery really comes in for it. I think for lots of parents, when you send a child to school, you don't see the control isn't visible in school. I mean, it is visible when you start to think about it, but we all were schooled. Most of us were schooled anyway, not everybody, but most of us. So we went through that whole process. We learned not to see the control. And now we send our child to school and we tell ourselves they like school, they're happy, they're learning, it's all good. And then when they're at home, suddenly we think, oh, but actually, when I'm giving them this maths worksheet, which apparently they're meant to like math, they're saying no. So I think the power balance changes at home. And I think the more that parents can learn from that changed power balance and they can allow themselves to really listen to what the child is saying, the more they might be able to form a more nuanced understanding of what's going on for that child. I know that maybe isn't what you're looking for, because maybe you're looking for a list of red flags, but I'm loath to do that because it starts being a bit like symptoms again. You know, it starts being like another checklist. And I think what we need to do is parents need to reconnect with their own knowledge about themselves, their child, and what makes their child happy and what makes their child thrive. Because I know that almost all parents have this when their children are young. In small children, you know, for small children, those small children are self-directed learners. You can't stop them from being self-directed learners. And most parents are very good at facilitating self-directed learning when their children are small. So it's not something that people can't do. It's something that we have to reconnect with, that sort of core value of what interests my child, what sets them on fire, and what can I do to help them do that.
And this comes back to trauma again, I think, within the parent and their own schooling situation and memories, because I've experienced it. You know, we've seen it time and time again when, you know, if we are, you know, we've been in and out of school system, you know, we've world schooled, homeschooled, and living in France, we put them back into school so they could learn another language, and currently moving back out into a self-directed education on Galileo. But when you're right, when you're standing over them trying to do make sure they're doing their homework because they have to, right? 8 hours of school, come home, first thing they do is get a biscuit, a glass of water, and open their books at the kitchen table. It's like, it drives me
Yeah.
crazy. But then when they ask for your help and you can't remember how to do the math, all of these old horrible feelings start bubbling up inside you, and then your stress rises, your anger rises, and it's just such a breakdown at that point between parent and child. Is dreadful.
Because it's interesting you say that, because one of the things that's interested me about talking to parents is how when their child's teacher talks to the parent feels like a child again. Teachers talk in a certain way. They're trained to do that. They need to do that to deal with their children. They talk like that to parents, and the parent is immediately feeling small, feeling like the punished child. And so you get this whole power structure going on where the parent doesn't feel empowered enough to stand up to the teacher, for example, to say, no, this homework is not helpful. Because the question is no longer, is this helpful for the child? The question is, what is school making us do? What does school say we have to do? And I think when you do self-directed education, you have to start with what is helpful for this child now? What does this child need right now? And actually, that isn't the question that the parents are allowed to ask themselves with relation to school, because school takes up a lot of energy. Even if it takes a lot of energy to get a child ready for school each morning. It takes a particular amount of energy if that child isn't happy at school. I mean, having a child who's unhappy at school is a draining and exhausting, emotionally upsetting experience. It's really tough. And the parent is the one who bears a lot of that brunt, because the parent is the one who has to persuade them every evening that they're going to go again tomorrow. They've got to keep going. And so I think, as I said, parents get sort of co-opted into that system. And then it's really hard for parents to step back, because it feels like they've been working so hard to get this child through. And then to say, you know what, actually, maybe it's just not the right thing. It's very hard to get any professional who will support you with that as well. And I think that's difficult, because as we've been schooled, we're used to looking for an expert opinion on something. We're used to someone saying, yes, that's the right thing to do. It's very hard to find someone who'll say, yes, it probably is the right thing to do to pull your child out of school.
And there's one other aspect at play. And I might butcher this. Please forgive me if I get this wrong. But it's like social anxiety disorder, because the social construct is so, like, this narrative is, you have kids, 2.4 kids, white picket fence, whatever, the whole deal. School, they have to go to the best school in your local area, yada, 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 yada.
Yeah.
So as soon as you step out and take them out of that for whatever reason,
you failed.
Yes.
Yeah.
How can we help people understand?
It's a reflection on you. I know this is where children's abilities and the way children perform serve as a reflection on their parents. And you can see that in family all over the world, where well-behaved children are the goal. And it's all about the parents. Again, it's not about the children. And it's very difficult to take your children out. And you will be told, people will tell you that it's neglectful. I've had people give me workbooks for my children when I've told that they said that they weren't doing them. I've had other parents at karate and things bring along photocopied workbooks and give them to me. And it's hard to stick with your feeling. And I've definitely wake up in the middle of the night going, my goodness, what if I'm wrecking their future? They should be at school, because school offers a false sense of security. And, in the UK, 40% of 16-year-olds don't get 5 good A to G. It's not even A to G anymore. 5 good enough grades at GCSE. So that's the school leaving exam. They don't get good enough results to go on to the next level. So they have spent 12 years in education, 12 years if you count reception, and they're not getting a basic qualification at the end. So the security that we're all buying into isn't really there. It's not real. The way we talk about school isn't the same as the way school really is for lots of kids. And I think we need to hear that narrative more. We need to hear about those children who find it really difficult, and not in the way of, oh, look at all these children who are disordered. And I think the way to do it, I guess, for parents is you need to connect with other parents who are making that choice. And you need to read about it. You need to think about it yourself and know why you're doing it, and remind yourself why you're doing it, because of course it's going to bring up all your insecurities. And of course it is. And that's the process of deschooling, actually, that letting go of those insecurities, but allowing them to be there, because we have to allow ourselves to think these things and challenge them for ourselves. I think a lot of the time we try and squash them, we try and push them out the way because it's just too difficult to think about them. But actually, the more we can allow ourselves to say, wow, this makes me really scared, actually. It's a scary decision. It's an absolutely terrifying decision. I'd say it's one of the scariest decisions I've made, not sending my children to school, because everybody is saying, I mean, when my child would have started school, we got a place in the great primary school just down the road, literally a few steps down the road. And it was one of these places that everybody was fighting for these places, and we got it. And then we turned around and said, actually, no, we're not going. And gosh, the feeling of, there was our ticket to the future and we're giving it up. People didn't understand, which is fair enough. They're not going to understand. And it is difficult. I think just accepting that it will be difficult maybe is one of the first steps. It's never an easy thing to do.
Yeah, it's very, very true. And we've all got stories like that, facing down it's the judgment really of your decisions. And it must be fascinating as well as a psychologist to see the kind of process that people go through when they deschool, because that is such a key part of the whole thing. It's for the parents to deschool is critical.
Yeah,
if this is going to work.
Yeah, it's absolutely critical. No, and I think that's why, I think parents being able to be flexible and to change their minds is at the heart of self-directed education. Because if the parents can't do that, then their children will be in an environment of worry and anxiety about education, because children are very sensitive to their parents' emotions, and parents need to be able to bring out their beliefs. And I think that's where the reading is really important, actually, to be able to face your own prejudices, face your own insecurities, and say, okay, they're there, but I'm going to make this choice anyway. And I think one of the things I find useful is thinking about values. What are my values? And it always, for me, comes down to the value really is the well-being of my children. And that's where I think most of my decisions are driven from. And actually, the well-being of my children is so much more important than what the neighbours think, that it just doesn't even compute, but it's easy to lose track of that. And so I think reconnecting with that value is really important. Just keeping, and people do that in all sorts of ways. Some people write cards for themselves and stick them around the house, or some people write. I think lots of people write in order to do this. They write about their experience and why they're making the choice they do. And I actually find that really useful. I write about it, and then if I'm feeling a bit wobbly, I can go back and read what I've written. I was like, oh yeah, I made loads of sense. I really had thought this through. And it really helps balance out that kind of moment of panic and that anxiety that maybe I'm doing the wrong thing.
Right. That's brilliant advice. And that leads us nicely onto your project of your book, talking about writing. So
yes. So my book is coming out hopefully next February. It's called Changing Our Minds, How Children Can Take Control of Their Education. And the pre-order link is on Amazon already. And it's all about how I think self-directed education makes sense from a psychological perspective. So there's quite a lot of psychological theory in there. There's stuff about learning, about motivation, but there's also really practical stuff about deschooling, how you can deschool, how you can support your children to make a different choice. And I hope that it will enable parents to feel more confident, to feel there's someone on their side, someone saying, yeah, you can do this. I know you can, and you can make a success out of this.
So last question, and it's a bit out of left field, so I'll give you some time.
Yeah.
If there was one person that you would like to read that book so we could get like a real good systemic change going on, some kind of revolution, who would that person be and why?
Well, it's an interesting question, because I sort of feel, as a psychologist, I feel that the people who I'd really like to read the book and who would really change things are going to be so defensive about it immediately that it might even lead to a kickback of saying, this is ridiculous, because that's how it happens, isn't it? Whenever there's talk about how we need to improve education, there's always this kickback. And then it's like, actually, we're going to have more testing. We're going to make it more rigid. We're going to raise standards. And the way we're going to raise standards is we're going to make things tougher. We're going to get those 4-year-olds doing it. And next it'll be 3-year-olds. And, there's that's generally what you get. I suppose it's about whether people could be open. I mean, I would like governments to be thinking along these lines. I would like governments to be reading and thinking, you know what, actually, this makes a lot of sense. And particularly now with COVID, it makes sense to put children in charge of their learning, because we're learning that parents are learning all over the world that it's very hard to control children's learning. Teachers already knew this because they work in schools, but teachers have lots of things on their side to help them control children, which parents don't have. They have a whole system of behavioural control, usually. They have the peer group. They have head teachers. They have the threat of all the things they can do to you. They can kick you out the class. They can give you a suspension. They can give you a detention. They have a whole behavioural system around them that enables them to control children's behaviour. Parents typically don't have quite so much power. So when a child says no at home, that child has much more, they can say no. It's difficult for the parents can't say, right, that's it, I'm suspending you, a week off from home, or you'll be stuck at home for 2 extra hours this afternoon in detention. It's very difficult for parents to do that kind of thing. Children have more power. So I've drifted away from your question, which is who would you like to read this? But I would like people in policy making areas to hear that actually maybe all this isn't necessary. We don't need to control children's learning for them to learn and become educated. We can, if we harness children's natural drive to learn rather than trying to control it, then actually they can learn amazing things and they will take control of their own learning. So my son is doing this self-managed learning college in Brighton. He's doing it online at the moment. And he's never done any organised maths in his life before, but he's nearly 12, he'll be 12 next month. And he has one-to-ones with somebody. And I hear him saying to him, today, I'd really like to do some algebra. I'd like to understand the area of circles. I'm like, okay, where did that come from? But he's in a completely different zone to me. He's never been made to learn anything. He's never been told he has to do these things. So for him, they're just fascinating. They're interesting puzzles. And I think when we can harness that, education will be a whole different ballgame.
That's what we all hope for, and I hope people listening have as well kind of come to the realization that there is a choice.
Yeah, that's what's really
that's important. There is a choice.
It is, and that school is always a choice, because you'll think it isn't. People will tell you that it isn't, but actually it always is.
Yeah. Well, Naomi, thank you so much for your time today. And yeah, truly fascinating. Really hope this helps many people. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.